Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Lily. I am currently a first-year grad student at Penn State, and today I am presenting research from my undergrad thesis that I conducted when I was a student at UW-Madison. And I will be presenting on how we should design election maps, specifically from the perspective of presidential election maps and based around news organizations. A lot of my study is really drawing from techniques that people have used at major news organizations, so I am definitely trying to credit that as much as possible in my talk. I will be talking about methodology a little bit at the beginning, but I'm not going too deep into that. I'm more focused on the visuals and the results within that, but I'd be happy to discuss methodology later with anyone who would like that. So just as a little bit of an introduction, I got interested in election map design because some of these high impact subjects like elections, climate change, COVID get mapped a lot by major news organizations. And in cartography, we've had a long history of these generalized best practices in map design, but not necessarily dedicated research to these specific high impact subjects. So I was really interested in studying that. And so I was studying 3 design factors for election maps specifically. The first being thematic map type, which is something that gets talked a lot about for American presidential election maps, especially with the Electoral College system and how we represent that. And we all know that there are a number of issues with the choropleth map, where you typically have to also indicate through text the number of electoral votes because it is not clear on the map itself. So in my study, I did have that text on every single state. The other 3 thematic map types I study here visually encode the number of electoral votes, so it was not written on the map for those. So the others were the block cartogram, which is also pretty commonly used for election maps, and then proportional symbol is less used for election maps, but is a relatively familiar thematic map type. And then diffuse cartogram in the academic literature was proposed pretty early on as a good alternative to the choropleth for election maps specifically. The second feature that I wanted to test in terms of election map design was color saturation. So more people are used to seeing the saturated map for election map design, really bright, bold colors, but as I'll get to in a little bit, there are possibly some good reasons to use a slightly more desaturated color scheme in relation to political partisanship and strain on the eyes and things like that. And then I also wanted to test visual accenting in the context of swing states. It can sometimes be overwhelming to look at the results for 50 states, and there's been some work in academia about using accenting to highlight only states or certain things for a particular reason, and one might be swing states because those are most likely to be the states to watch on election night. So for my survey itself, I had a lot of multiple choice questions that I gave to 240 online survey participants, which captured people across the entire United States rather than a university study that would be limited in terms of demographics. I asked questions at 3 different scales. So these multiple choice questions were elementary, which would be 1 or 2 states, general in terms of a region in the country, and then global were about the country as a whole. Within these question scales, I had 2 question types. So one was number of electoral votes, and one was winner. So winner is indicated by color. Electoral votes is either text or visually encoded. And then within these questions, I was measuring 4 things. So all of these multiple choice questions, I measured accuracy and speed. There was 1 question per page for all of the users. So I was able to measure the time per question. Afterwards, I asked users their preference about the maps that they saw, and I also captured demographics. So for the study itself, all users received all 4 thematic map types in different orders, and then everyone had some level of consistency for the other design features. So they either exclusively received saturated or desaturated, and then exclusively received visual accenting or not. So to go back a little bit into how I chose all of these things. So I looked at 20 news organizations on the night of the 2020 American presidential election to figure out what news organizations were actually doing for this election. I looked at 12 American news organizations as well as 8 international news organizations. Most had multiple thematic map types that you could toggle between online, which is why these numbers are going to add up to more than 20. Most news organizations do use a choropleth, 14 of them did. Cartogram, not all are necessarily using the block cartogram, but it is, as a general concept, pretty widely used for 11 out of 20. And then, as I said before, proportional symbol, even though it's common for things like COVID maps, it's kind of less common for election maps. For color saturation, as I was going through all these news organizations on election night, and especially because I was spending like 8 hours looking at these, some of the really bright saturated colors were starting to be kind of straining to me, and I was really interested that a few organizations chose these more desaturated colors. And it's kind of hard at this point for people to go beyond the convention of red and blue, so color hue may not be where cartographers have the opportunity to play with color, but color saturation and color value might be the places where we can do that. And then finally, in terms of swing states, I saw that particularly some international news organizations had this option to only look at swing states. Now, I don't necessarily agree with which states they called swing states, but there was one German news organization that allowed users to toggle back and forth to kind of decrease information overload and just focus on the states that might be most likely to determine the results of the election. So that was kind of the background, what led to all of this. Now I'm going to get into the results of this a little bit. So for thematic map type, definitely a limitation of this study was that I had to include the text with the number of electoral votes on the choropleth map, which means that that is evaluated slightly differently than the other thematic map types. So for the most simple questions, the pretty basic ones about number of electoral votes, the choropleth did perform the best because there is actually text on the map. However, I think that can be a good lesson for no matter the thematic map type that a journalist may choose to place either the text directly on the map or perhaps having a pop-up when users were to hover over a state to directly tell them the number of electoral votes so they don't have to guess, no matter the thematic map type. However, the block cartogram performed almost as accurately for most question types as the choropleth map, and for questions about the country as a whole, asking especially about number of electoral votes, it's much easier to see that visually in something like the block cartogram than it is in the choropleth map, and therefore for those questions the block cartogram does perform better than the choropleth, despite that being the most common one that people use. There were definitely some issues with the proportional symbol and the diffuse cartogram. They're just a little bit more confusing, less intuitive to users, so those didn't perform quite as well, but there is I'm finding the strong backing for the block cartogram, which is something that many news organizations are already beginning to adopt. Additionally, as I said, I asked users what they preferred in terms of all of these design decisions, and they definitely ranked these two very highly. For visual accenting, this is a spot where I feel like there were some limits to my study specifically because I exclusively had static maps in my study just due to the limits of an undergraduate study. And I think that visual accenting worked much better when users could toggle back and forth and kind of understand exactly what was happening. I do think it's possible in this study that some people were confused what the visual accenting meant, or possibly that the states that are fully opaque represented higher value than the partially transparent states. Because I had a few question types where actually users who received the accented map answered questions faster but less accurately than those who received the more traditional non-accented map. And I think that likely the case is they made a snap judgment about the accented state because it stood out so well. that they assumed that that was the correct answer for that type of question. Again, this is not the only way to do visual accenting. As we saw in the news organization map, they made the states that were not swing states completely gray. I didn't want to do that in my study because I still wanted the other states to be readable. However, there is definitely a limit in that where people might see it as partial votes or just a lesser value. So I would encourage, if someone were interested in trying to adopt this at a news organization, to definitely make it interactive, not to just display a static map that is accented. Users preferred having no accenting. That is something that I'm finding pretty consistently throughout this study, that users kind of have an idea of what they expect election maps to look like, so they are preferring those standards throughout my study. For color saturation, there was not a ton of information regarding accuracy and speed. For this, there wasn't a huge difference. However, what I did find interesting was for some of the slightly more complicated questions, the users who received the saturated map actually answered a little less accurately and a little more slowly. And that, I think, potentially could be due to eye strain or just strain of some other sort as they are viewing this brighter, bolder map. And now users on average took about 30 minutes to complete this study, but if they were to be staring at a screen for the entire night of the election, some of those impacts of these brighter maps could be compounded. So I am interested in that, but I couldn't fully study that in this study. Users, again, preferred the saturated map because that is what they are more used to seeing. However, I thought it was interesting that users who received the desaturated map only slightly preferred the saturated map, but those who received the saturated one very significantly preferred it. So users who did receive the desaturated one were not hugely offended by it. They still liked it pretty similarly to the saturated one, which to me suggests that people could get used to that and be okay with that if that is what they are seeing every day. So as kind of a conclusion to this part of my study, what I'm really trying to emphasize here is that I don't think that there's actually one best map type and map design decision when it comes to American presidential election maps. I really think that interactivity and user choice is kind of the key here, and that's what a lot of news organizations are already doing. They're already allowing people to toggle somewhere between like 3 and 5 thematic map types, and I think that makes a lot of sense. However, we know that many users are never going to click beyond the default map that is presented to them. They are just going to look at that one. So I think that there is a strong argument to have the block cartogram as the default for users who are never going to click beyond that, because we've seen that it performs almost as well as the choropleth for simpler questions, and for ones about the country as a whole actually performs better. And then if users would like to click onto the choropleth, they could. I also want to say I really like how, for example, the New York Times on the left here has actual visual previews of what the other thematic map types looks like rather than just text. You don't want to assume that the users know what all these map types are. And then I would say a similar thing for interactivity. I think it's interesting and intriguing to do something like only emphasizing particular states, but again, you don't want to have that to be the default. You don't want to confuse any of your users. So if you have the time as a news cartographer, that would be really interesting to implement for people who want to explore farther, but it doesn't need to be the default. And now I want to add one more thing that came from a conversation with Carl Churchill, because he was curious how I thought some of these results might influence midterm election map design. And I think that we can draw a lot from presidential election map design in here. For example, the block cartogram is a really logical choice for the House. It's already one seat per state, and it looks very similar to the electoral college map. However, there could be some hesitancy in using the slightly confusing look of the block cartogram. So one option, as this French news organization did, was to place a block cartogram on top of a traditional geographic map of the United States to make it a little easier to locate all of these states. When it comes to accenting, again, I'll say interactivity would make a lot of sense. However, we could choose options such as Al Jazeera did to just put a highlight around the state, so that way we don't obscure the data, but it does add a little extra visual emphasis. And in terms of saturation, I think there's benefits and drawbacks to each. There could be low vision readability issues in terms of the desaturated maps, or if someone has low screen brightness. However, there could be eye strain or potential political polarization and activated emotions associated with slightly bolder maps. So there can definitely be an in-between, though. Like in this study, I had to just have 2 options, but there can be somewhere in between those ranges of color saturation, and I think that saturation and value will be really interesting to play with within red and blue. So that is all I have to say about election maps for now, but I love to talk about this subject, and I would be very happy to answer questions on Slack or anytime for the remainder of the conference. Thank you.